Hold on. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'm a bit one-sided at the moment. Try and get this internet playing nice. Why is it the Windows always wants to update when you've got something to do? Oh well. Okay. I'm feeling a little bit on the blind side. I fear. Okay, I do apologise. But again, Windows is wanting to update right in the middle of this. Let's give this another go. Let's put this here and put that there. Sorry. I'm believing that I'm live. Okay, let's try this. I'm hoping that you can see my PowerPoint, but it'd be a bit peculiar if you can't. Good afternoon, my name's Dr. Alex Holmes, and I'm hoping to present this webinar on assessment and working scientifically at Key Stage 3. Now, I can't really tell if I'm talking to a microphone or not, so I'm just going to hope that you can all hear me, and obviously if you can't, then I do believe that Smart Learning will be recording it and available another time. So just to give you a bit of background, my name's Dr. Alex Holmes, and I've been assessment consultant for Smart Learning now for about a year. I've worked on their summative tests, but obviously that's just one part of what I do. I'm also a full-time science teacher in West Sussex, and obviously try and practice what I preach and try and do a little bit of everything. Now, I've had a few questions from people with regards to this formative versus time issue, which I think is quite a significant thing that most teachers kind of encounter on our journey to trying to assess children. I will try and kind of answer them mid-seminar, as it were. Okay, let's see if this will work. Now, I kind of felt the need to kind of put DWEC in. I know that most head teachers at the moment have kind of caught the DWEC bug, as it were, and are talking about obviously trying to insert the kind of growth mindset into the kind of potential of their students, as well as their staff, probably. The thing is that although she's not really an educationalist, she's a psychologist, but actually what she says is a lot of it is common sense, but sometimes that common sense needs I suppose acknowledging, yeah. So we read it and we think, well, yeah, that is common sense, but we haven't thought about it before we read it, if you see what I mean. So the whole idea behind putting her there is obviously to think about the fact that we are, as educationalists, we're having to produce assessment and assessment criteria without the kind of fallback of using levels anymore, and so actually we're engaging on kind of a whole new area of assessing and assessment criteria. So I put her in there because we're going to have to, I mean, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to assess without levels, and so there are various ways to go about it, and this is really the beginning of a journey that I think will probably be quite a long one, but you know, I think we've got to start somewhere, and so with Smart Science assessment material and any other, I mean, there's lots of different assessment materials out there, they're all trying to kind of, it's like a stab in the dark, really. Anyway, so what are we going to do? Well, hopefully we'll have a look at some of the assessment models and then really have a think about what the Ofsted criteria are in terms of what they want, their expectations, and as well as the kind of current research that's out there that a lot of sort of teachers don't really have time to look at, as well as the kind of classroom practice that I think we all engage in on a day-to-day basis. And then just have a quick look at Smart Science. I have a bias towards Smart Science because obviously I work for them, but you know, this really applies to quite a lot of assessment materials outside, you know, that are available at the moment. Okay, so obviously the challenge was set, and you know, I think we're all pretty aware of the fact that levels were moved in order to negate the amount of teaching to the test that was going on, and we've all started working towards the new Progress 8 sort of targets instead of kind of this multi-testing that was going on. And I suppose in some ways that we should have expected it, that the national curriculum tests kind of went, and we should have anticipated the fact that some tests at the end of Key Stage 3, they were kind of go, and with that we're going to go the kind of the ladders that were part of that diktat, really. They were part of the kind of the great ladder that every child was expected to climb through Key Stage 3 until they attained sort of their end of Key Stage 3 test level. So we got rid of those levels, and in theory everything's got easier in terms of planning, but you know, that is a direct DFE quote. I'm not entirely sure that the greater flexibility in assessment is maybe such an easy thing. I suspect the person who wrote that didn't really acknowledge the enormity of the greater flexibility in assessing pupils' learning of that statement. So in terms of Ofsted, this is the real crunch, really, is that, you know, Ofsted don't really expect us, well, we're not got levels, so we can't use levels, and yet they do expect every school to be able to assess their pupils without anything to assess them, without any kind of guidelines. So it's a bit like, I suppose, I've always used the analogy that it's a bit like saying, right, we want every child to get, well, every person to get from sort of Cornwall from the south coast to the north of Scotland. There are various roads to go, but we're going to take all the road signs away and see who gets there first. And so it's a bit of an analogy like that. It's just take away all the traffic signals, all the traffic signs, and expect somebody to get there eventually, without actually giving them any sort of maps or guidance with how to do it. So so on the one hand we've got this great flexibility and this great openness, and then on the other side of it, that obviously there's still an expectation that somehow we've got to measure children and produce these sort of, you know, we've got a number crunch and track them as well. So, you know, that's the kind of state of affairs where we find ourselves now. As for that, you know, assessment is part of, you know, it's the critical part of a school curriculum, because without the kind of assessment model you can't really measure how the school is doing. So unfortunately that all ties back into the DFE every year in terms of a whole school thing. Now, I was looking at science, but we have to acknowledge that this is happening across all aspects of the curriculum, and we have to look at how assessment models, first of all, fit in with what we teach and schemes of work with the kind of the somewhat lessened Key Stage 3 curriculum, but also how our school or your school relates to schools down the road. So it kind of there has to be some kind of consistency, because if we don't have that consistency, then the assessment becomes meaningless, really, in terms of, you know, comparative models and how you are doing as a school compared to maybe how the school in the next county is doing. So again, we've got this struggle, this conflict between what we kind of want to do with this great freedom and actually what we've also got to do in terms of measuring progress. So we've also, this is, you know, this leads nicely to accuracy, because obviously we're all scientists, and so it's quite a difficult place to be, isn't it, where we have to actually to consistently judge a child's progress in terms of our teaching, find out where they are and what they're able to do and where we can go with it, and yet at the same time we'll have nothing to measure them against. So again, it's a bit like, you know, go back to our road analogy, except this time we've got to find the distance between the south of England and Scotland, and we haven't got any rulers. So we've got no units to measure in. So so this is the difficulty that we find ourselves at the moment. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that the way that some of the research is going and some of the kind of literature online at the moment is going, things will develop that will kind of not fix this, but will change the way that we teach. But unfortunately, we're right in a position now where we can't just automatically overnight become this new thing. We're kind of at the beginning of this kind of journey that will eventually change how we teach and how we measure progress. But because we're in this kind of transitory place, then actually we're going to have to still kind of assess in a little bit of the old-fashioned way, because we still are being judged on the accuracy of our assessment in terms of what Ofsted expect from us and what the DFE expect from us. Similarly, we also have to show that pupils have progress. That's one of the big things. One of the big things from Ofsted is obviously we have to not only show progress during the lesson, but we have to actually show that the children have made progress. And I suppose that's ultimately the crux of Progress 8 and where Progress 8 has come from. So they've taken away the kind of middle bit between sort of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4 with Progress 8, but in order to show that what you're teaching in Key Stage 3 is actually having some effect, then obviously we still have to assess at Key Stage 3. So we have to set those targets, and we kind of have to look at the expectations of what their Key Stage 4 results will be based on those Key Stage 2 results, but actually again, there's nothing actually physically to measure Key Stage 3 with. So yes, and then of course you have this learning journey where we have to be able to demonstrate not only what we know about the pupils, but obviously we have to allow the pupils to have a kind of say in how they're being assessed and what we think of them and what they think of themselves, and have a kind of a kind of in-depth understanding. And I suppose that's more like that's giving the responsibility to them to some extent. But again, if you're giving the responsibility for them to develop their own learning based on a kind of imagined number or an imagined word, then that word might not have any meaning to them as yet, because again we're right at the beginning of this transitory stage. So you know that in terms of where the levels were, a lot of kids actually knew where they stood with a number. They kind of understood that. Equally, a lot of teachers actually knew where they stood with that number. And so removing those numbers again is removing that kind of criteria for measuring, and we again in this position where actually nobody knows exactly what is what we're measuring in and what we're measuring against, but we do know what we're measuring, which is obviously the learning that the child is making. So going back to our assessment, so we need to think about how we assess things now and assess people. And of course, there's obviously been a lot of work about formative assessment, and obviously, I think as teachers we acknowledge, and I think I certainly acknowledge that formative assessment is very much the assessing that you do as a teacher. That is your job. You do actually formatively assess all the time. And in answer to one of the questions that was put to me with regards to skills, then we're measuring children's skills through formative assessments. That's really what that boils down to, is that we can see how a child works, we can see how they work in groups, we can see how they work with experimental sort of precision and apparatus. So that's a kind of on the job at that moment in time kind of assessment. And as far as Black and William, I mean they are very much when they were writing, I mean so a while back now, when they were writing, very much formative assessment was not the thing. It was very much summative assessment that everybody lent on. But I think now that the current teaching methods incorporate quite a lot of formative assessment, albeit that formative assessment is not precisely measurable. Yet it's very difficult to put a number on on certain aspects of formative assessment. And so just to clarify, we have to remember actually that assessment is about giving advice. That's fundamentally where I think that a lot of I fear that DFE maybe and possibly Ofsted, they kind of forget that that's what actually assessment is about, and it's about guidance and guiding pupils. And in terms of the way that we assess pupils, we do that every day in every lesson for pretty much every child, is that, you know, we are guiding those pupils through their kind of journey of learning, and again, it's a very immeasurable amount. You can't really put a number to something that we do with pupils, and each pupil being different will have a different kind of measurement descriptor. So first of all, you know, to recap what formative, I realise that I'm probably talking to an awful lot of experienced teachers, but you know, as formative assessment, again, what I said is that it is about what we do with children all the time, and it is, you know, it's an inherent part of teaching that we are not only teaching them new knowledge and new skills, but we're actually then checking that they kind of understand that new knowledge and that new skill by questioning, by experimental methods, by right conclusions. That it's an ongoing thing, and it's an inherent part of the job. Whereas, of course, that summative learning and summative assessment, which is, I suspect, probably the kind of assessment that when people use the word assessment, that's what they're thinking of, is really checking what has been learnt. So it's a knowledge check or an understanding check, and actually it's a snapshot of a time rather than an ongoing process. So in terms of summative assessment, really, you know, we have to acknowledge that it's going to measure what a child knows, but as a teacher, we have to acknowledge also that it's a measure of how we taught, and really, I suspect probably a lot of assessment that we engage, a lot of summative assessment that we engage in, is about the feedback on actually if the whole class did really badly in one question, that should have a significant impact on our teaching. Now that obviously I suppose incorporates another question that I got with regards to a lot of the summative tests. And this is across all the different, I know at least 3 different publishers, and they've all included summative tests as part of their schemes of work. You know, that we have such a short time frame that, you know, how do you go back and fix it? Well, the schemes of work, to some extent, they're all adaptable, and so if you get with your feedback, you've got numbers didn't understand, back and visit it, and you know, you put your scheme of work to one side for a bit and you fix that particular problem. I'm always a bit concerned that if people are almost more worried about the end of unit test results than they are about kind of revising the kind of the teaching that they've done. I would always say that, you know, there may be some bits of that scheme of work, because actually we've got so much flexibility now, that can be moved around or combined with another unit. So quite a lot of, you know, if you're talking about pressure, you can stick something about forces in there. If you're talking about genetics, you can add a bit of cells in there. You know, you can shift things around accordingly to, if you get the impression that a class haven't understood something, you can adapt your teaching accordingly. So just looking at, you know, how do we fix things? So, well, I mean, the left-hand column really are the part of the planning. So, you know, we monitor things, we watch what's going on. These are all methods that I think they're not in every lesson. I don't think they should be in every lesson, but that's what happens. That's what we do, and that's how we. Summative test assessment is actually one tiny part of that, out of that great big long list, and I suspect there's probably loads more out there. But you know, you're planning for both literacy and numeracy, as well as obviously checking what they know, or, you know, the preconceptions, the misconceptions, as well as then feeding back to them when they've done the work. All these things are part of assessing children. You know, you plan for their learning and then you check they've learnt it. With summative assessment being absolutely really 1/10, I think that is, possibly 1/12. So, you know, it's a very small part of the actual assessment process. So just I don't know how many, I suspect I probably might be even talking to some psychologists, maybe, I don't know, is that obviously that there is quite a lot of cognitive science research out at you know, how we encourage kids to learn stuff, and actually this is to it's not really teaching to the test. This is I suppose engaging kids in learning to learn, as it were. And as teachers, I think we need to be aware of some of these things, because things like distributed practice basically means that we move things around, and so we stuff, you know, sorry, it's a very untechnical word, but we stuff certain concepts from one area into another topic. So, for example, putting your cells into genetics as well as classification, putting forces and pressure and speed and motion, all those things, kind of distributing them through the different topics, because science is very much, it's a subject of many facets, and actually you can find quite a lot of pressure in the animal world if you're thinking about claws and beaks and you know, crustacea and similar things like that. There's forces coming out, you know, coming everywhere there. Equally, if you think about chemistry and chemical reactions and enzymes, that can also be fed back obviously into rates of reaction as well as digestive system. So we've got, you know, there's multifacets there. So if we incorporate top that, not in earlier lessons, but it's actually helping children to encourage, you know, it encourages them to understand things as not separate entities. And obviously that familiarity is part of that overlearning. It's the familiarity becomes basic knowledge, and I think having basic knowledge is about, if you think about driving a car, if you can remember driving a car or learning to ride a bicycle, in the initial instance you had to think about loads of things at once, and yet you probably, with practice, with the familiarity, it gets to a point where actually that's base knowledge, and actually you don't have to think about driving or riding a bicycle anymore, you just do it, and then there's all the other things that you can pile on top. And so that overlearning is quite significant in terms of making the familiarity become the foundation, so they don't actually have to think about cells and difference between animal and plant cells anymore. It just is. There is just a difference. So again, you know, all these four aspects, all really, they're all saying the same thing, but in all those different kind of techniques, that what you're doing is you're encouraging sort of a base layer of knowledge that allows a mastery on top of it. It allows things to happen in different contexts, and it allows children to then have a kind of the foundation in order to build sort of new ideas on top of that, and to see the links between things. And if you think about your own knowledge, there will be some knowledge now that you are masters in, to the point that if you're a chemist, then you probably don't really bat an eyelid at the difference between atoms and elements, or atoms and molecules, because it just is. There's no thinking about it. You have got that foundation layer, and on top of that you can then overlay molecular theories and rates of reaction and collisions and etc. etc. You can overlay that on top of it and have a more in-depth understanding of how it all works together. So how does smart science work with that? Well, you know, as their assessment consultant, I came from I looked into how the best way to do it, and there is no best way. This really is based on my work and the reading that I've done around it, but having seen how misconceptions kind of arise and are inherent in quite a lot of kids' minds, as well as actually quite a lot of teachers' minds, the assessment sheets are always a good start, because an assessment sheet is there to find out what your baseline is, where you're starting from, where the pupil is starting from. If you find that a whole class have been taught already you know, a topic, then and they understand it, then really, you know, there is very little need to then teach it again, unless you see or you find that they've got a gigantic misconception. So thinking about things like space and the fact that there's there's a classic misconception that there's no gravity in the International Space Station. There is. So you know, there's those kind of those basic misconceptions that you know, a whole class might have because they've all had the same teacher previously, or they've all kind of learned the same thing. So the assessment sheets are there to find out what you're starting with, to find out what kind of canvas, I suppose, you're about to paint on, and then the end of unit test is there to see, you know, how they've done with what you've taught, how you've taught it, and where they might go next. So that was the thinking between the two tests, and then obviously the end of year test looks at them revisiting all those topics and sort of committing some of them, I suppose, to memory, but also developing their understanding a little bit, or putting things in slightly different contexts. So that was the idea behind it, so that if you're working with a class that you don't teach very often, then sometimes it is quite a good thing to see kind of what they know already before you then kind of teach anything to them. So obviously there are lots of models out there at the moment, and the flight path that we've got is I'm not entirely sure, but flight paths, I like the idea of flight paths because I find them very linear. But again, this is it's basically based on Bloom's. It's based on those kind of key criteria from Bloom's taxonomy, and that's just the developing mindset of children. Now the thing is that obviously that these always seem very linear, and as you will probably agree, a child might excel in explaining something verbally, or being able to do a scientific method very precisely, very accurately, generate some really good data, but then be unable to answer a question about it. So it's worth remembering that fact when you're looking at assessment models, is actually quite a lot of the time that you are testing their ability to answer a question, which ultimately, I'm afraid, is what a GCSE is about, is the ability to answer a question. And so even though you may know that a child has mastered some key concept and is able to explain why the sky is blue, they might not be able to explain that in words on paper. But here was that the model was here to try and link everything together, so that although we're working in this peculiar place where we've got no levels, as it were, we've still got some kind of direction. So at least when we're travelling on our unlabelled road from the south coast of Scotland, at least we know we're heading north. So there is a kind of a direction to it. So it's building on the old curriculum levels, because at the moment, as I think we're in that transient place, because we don't know. We know where we've been, but we don't know where we're going. So we kind of need to set ourselves some kind of target, as it were, some kind of guidance. So we're going to have to use the old maps, and on top of those old maps, then just base the new ideas on top of those. And so obviously the learning is the levels, the lower levels. So it's being able to recall it. I mean, they are straight from Bloom's. It's being able to recall and describe. It's being able to just state things, whereas the mastering, similar to the old level 5s and 6s, really is being able to apply that knowledge to slightly different contexts, and obviously expanding. Well, I hate to say the old level 7 kids, but you kind of know the children who can synthesize ideas from different concepts and put them together and join them up, maybe not even just within science, but within other subjects in the curriculum. They're getting to a point where actually they're forming that foundation of knowledge, and so they're now being able to put things on top of it, because they've got the basis there, set firm, and they're not really having to think about it anymore. Now, obviously, the GCSE flight paths, this is just about in date, but we're not entirely sure yet. But obviously, these are projected estimates to equivalent GCSEs. But again, the flight paths, they're not like Progress 8. They're not saying that if you get this, then you must get this. This is just really just based again on the old levels, and just matching them up with the new GCSE levels, with just to see the difference, really, just to see how the thing all compares with where we've been. I'm not entirely sure sometimes where we might be going. So really, the testing is there to just see that that pupils are making some kind of progress in there, that they have learned something, and it's allowing you, because again it's within a scheme of work and it's not something that's completely kind of made up out of thin air. It's being able to give you some kind of idea on a wider scale, rather than just a school by school basis, because it's the tests are there. It's allowing you to just see where you are in relation to others, and see where the children can see where they are in relation to the others. Now, some of the test content didn't mirror the scheme of work, and it was put in there for a purpose. Some of the questions are, you may recognise them as old national curriculum questions, because actually if you looked at the national curriculum tests, of which I've seen many in my years, you'd have found that actually some of the questions has popped up now and again, and they were there for a reason then, and they were put in. Some of them were adapted national curriculum test questions because they were good questions, but there are also some very difficult questions in there, and unfortunately that's the reflection of the new GCSEs to come, which will be questions that are not quite so obvious, I think. So it's a younger age for children to start not feeling like a failure, but acknowledging that actually some things are really difficult, and in order to make progress they have to work hard. It's really going back to Dweck's growth mindset again, and acknowledging that if you get something wrong, it's not a catastrophe, it's actually part of that learning process. So then I used a revised version of Bloom's taxonomy. The words change every now and again, but again it's looking at that difference between recall and recall and being able to create and evaluate your own things, which are a scale of different thinking. So here again, mapped the models, and really just looking at working scientifically, because ultimately I've had a few questions about skills as well. Is that obviously science skills, developing science skills are common, and I think the CBI has recently just again requested more children we need more people with science skills, but at the moment science skills are I'm not entirely sure whether how they're going to be tested. Nobody really knows, but of course they've been removed, as it were, from the teacher assessed part of the GCSE. So really, in terms of what is working scientifically, we have to question, well, what is science in the real world first of all, and what do scientists actually do? And I seem to recall, and most of you probably got degrees in science, that it involves asking a question where you haven't got an answer, and then doing some experiments or doing some observations, and probably still not having an answer, and progressively just doing that until you get an answer. Now, time is the issue, obviously, in school for us to be able to do that. So although I advocate doing as much investigation as possible, again, looking at those key skills of testing and evaluating and communicating the kind of conclusions, we haven't really got the time to have a complete nothingness of this is some equipment here, and this is a question. Use the equipment to work out an answer to the question, and then compare it to the real science. So there isn't enough time to do that. So we have to kind of use a little bit of is a little feature editing, as it were, to help children be able to do those investigations. And lead them and guide them through there, so that they actually get to use the knowledge that you've taught them in slightly different situations. So there's 5 strands of working scientifically: thinking, investigating, obviously using the evidence, using some maths to analyse, and then communicating results. And so that would be things like writing conclusions. And really, they're the kind of traditional ways of doing science, albeit with new kind of ways of titling them, I suppose. How do they reflect real science? Well, you're asking the question, you've got a problem. Using models is in there. I know that that some of the working scientifically work, it does look at planning and doing investigations, and again interpreting the data, and it kind of covers all those key skills in a very kind of a shortened version of what we'd call real science. So the real science that we're looking at are, that's what we call key skills. Well, the key skills actually probably across the board in the curriculum, but at the moment we're just focusing on science, and so it's being able to do all those different things. So looking at the key skills and developing them prior to Key 4, and then obviously encouraging kids to have a look at a problem and try and think about it in answering the question scientifically. And so, you know, that I suppose at the moment for Key Stage 3, that's as good as we can get in terms of working scientifically, for fear that thousands of observations are very small. The minutiae of science may not be the thing that would engage them really. So to summarise, I mean, this is what Smart Science tries to do. You know, we try and just get them to think about what they're learning and think about how science works in order. I almost don't believe I said that. Yeah, think about how science works in order, you know, to answer questions using apparatus and observation and analysis of data in order to conclude something, or at least form a hypothesis which can then be retested. And also, you know, just trying to assess, evaluate the learning as well as the skills, to have some kind of monitoring, so that we know that when we're doing our job, you know, we're doing our job well. So in order to do that, we have to have this kind of basis for assessment, and setting targets that not only, you know, remember that will be the children's targets to show their progress, but actually it'll be our targets as well to show, you know, what we've done well and what we could do better, and how we can move ourselves forwards in terms of being, you know, teachers. These are some of the references that I have used in order to produce this presentation, and I believe I'm almost at the end. Now I'm in this very peculiar place where I'm not sure whether anybody has heard me, but I'm hoping. I'm also in a peculiar place where my computer is not playing nice anymore. Thank you very much. Ooh. Okay, and that is me, I hope. I have a lady down in the corner here. She is very small, and she is the only evidence that I'm online. I would offer questions, but I'm not sure I'm talking to anybody at all. Oh, hello. Oh, thank you. Thank you.